Nestled in a narrow lot on a quiet street in White Bear Lake lives a couple of lovebirds.
We love each other.
For 52 years.
52 years.
And it's fair to say that Jim and Norma Mengel's first meeting was a gift from God.
At a church where he was a student pastor.
Yeah.
And actually, I was a visiting nurse in the neighborhood and then was a member at the church there.
Becoming a pastor in Pennsylvania was an option Jim had considered early in life, but it wasn't the only option.
And then I had it in mind, but I thought, well, I'm going to be a preacher or a printer. And so when I finished high school, I entered college immediately.
Jim worked his way through college as a printer, putting his passions for preaching aside for the time being. But pursuing his passions came to a stop upon his graduation.
Well, immediately on college graduation, the war broke out in Korea. The draft was after us, and I joined the National Guard with my brother and cousin, but almost immediately the unit was federalized.
Jim completed his military service and found that his once pro-war view would change. Looking back now, he knows when that change actually took place.
I'd started, without my knowledge, I think, when I was 16, and my uncle was killed in France, Second World War. And I can remember my mother screaming as she heard the news on the phone, and what it meant to my grandparents, her parents. It was crushing. They had been married about 8 years, and they were pregnant with our first child, who was born after he was inducted, and he was killed within a year in France. And I didn't, at the time, I was kind of macho, gung-ho, supporting the war and so forth. But I guess it was years later that I became more active in the peace movement.
Yeah.
The peace movement played a critical role throughout Jim and Norma's life. Jim's desire to do something about the war was fueled during the time he was once again working as a printer and also serving as a preacher.
When we lived in Korea, the Vietnam situation was just heating up. And he was very aware of that because he was a civilian chaplain for the Air Force in Korea.
As I was serving on the military base there, as a civilian, I could see that men were coming and going through Korea to Vietnam, some in bags, And so when I got back, I was in demonstrations in D.C. We were living in Baltimore. We demonstrated at different places. And finally, my wife took me on this particular day to another demonstration, which I thought was going to be more or less the same. But it became very important because that was the first time he was arrested and ended up in jail.
Jailed was Phil Berrigan, a peace activist who was a Roman Catholic priest. Phil was born in Minnesota, served in World War II, and was ordained in 1955. He was active in the civil rights movement, and Jim joined him and two others in an anti-war action that would change their lives forever.
That was the Baltimore Four. October 27th, 1967. We gave our blood the night before, and they used that on the draft files. It was supposed to be significant theologically. If you read the Bible, blood offering, and at the last minute, I decided not to actually pour blood. I thought, at the last minute, I thought this should be more attached to the Bible and to the reason for our doing it, which was spiritual. And so I passed out Bibles at the anointing, if you will. The other three did pour blood. Our own blood.
Jim's decision to pass on pouring blood and instead pass out Bibles resulted in a commuted sentence for Jim, but not for the other three. All were labeled federal criminals. It was a difficult time for this peace-loving couple who were now also parents.
I worked for the Baltimore City Health Department, and we had 2 small children. And I did take him that day where he was going, but I didn't know what he was doing. So I was not actively involved, nor was I too supportive at that point in time. And
Nor was
his
my
family had a very big problem with it. So anyway, we struggled through that for a long time with our phone tapped and the FBI visiting at various times.
Shortly after the couple had married, Norma became the breadwinner in the family, not by choice, but by necessity, after she noticed something about Jim that caused great concern.
I didn't know it all. I had it until we were married. And about 7 months afterward, we discovered it.
And I'll tell you how. He was a pastor in Clarington, Ohio, along the Ohio River. And so once in a while, I would go on home visits with him to the parishioners. And a couple times he fell asleep in the middle of the visit. And I said, there has to be something wrong. And it was finally diagnosed as narcolepsy, which was not very well known at that time, but caused lots of problems.
Like everything else, the couple worked through Jim's ongoing battle with narcolepsy, a condition that Jim knows now he's had at least since first grade.
I would sleep in class. I would sleep reading. I know now that I can't read a book. It takes too long because I fall asleep. So I read headlines. I watch the media. I can learn things that way, as most illiterates do. Some are very intelligent. I've found out I have an IQ of 125, but I don't seem to be able to use it properly.
And if you look around our little house, you can see that books are quite important.
Yeah, I like books.
So what else does an 84-year-old self-described illiterate do to stay connected to his passion for the printed word and to his local community?
Well, I work 2 days a week, really. It amounts to that. And Tuesday and Wednesday, delivering the White Bear Press in White Bear, downtown and around downtown.
And so the man of print and peace-loving principles continues to live his passions. Jim walks his paper route, delivering the news with love in his heart and a purpose, he says, to serve others the way Jesus did. And after 52 years of marriage, these lovebirds know well that tough times and bad news are written in our lives for a reason.
Even bad news can be a prompting to us to tell the good news, because in almost every case we know the answers. We know what to do. We know we should love one another and love our enemies, but we don't do it all the time. Read the Bible and the newspaper together, and then act accordingly. Act according to your faith in regard to both. And the bad news needs to be solved and remedied by the good news.